Today's talk is about storytelling basics. And I'm a little wary of the word basics because I know from being back in school, you might have been one of those people who said, oh, all those basic courses, beginning courses, the one-on-ones, those were the courses that a lot of us didn't like. We were eager for the more fun, advanced courses when you got into the extracurricular stuff, the fun stuff. But the reason I wanted to do this was that a lot of people have asked the question, how do I tell stories? What do I do with this idea? We keep hearing everyone saying things like Richard Branson says, you cannot be a business person successfully in the 21st century unless you're a storyteller. And that's all well and good, but what does that really mean? How do you actually tell stories? You know it's not a campfire story. You know it's not a fairy story. You know it's certainly not a bedtime story. But what is it? And when you go to read the books, this is what drives me crazy. This is what motivated me to do this, is I go and read things that all talk about things like the hero's journey. They would talk about big companies like Budweiser, how do they brand themselves with stories? Or they would talk about Nike or other companies that sold products that were really iconic companies. And that's great. You want to learn from those companies. But if you're a small business, which is what a lot of us are these days, and there's more and more of us who are independent professionals, solopreneurs, we really cannot use the same branding techniques as the big companies. So that's what my whole goal is in my business, is to change the way we think about marketing ourselves as small businesses, because the big company rules don't work for us. And a lot of times, if you work with a different mentor, someone who has a different orientation, storytelling for a small service business is so unique to you that if you try to learn from someone else, if they're not the same archetype, and we'll look into that shortly, then you could actually be misled when you try to use them as a model for your own marketing. So we're going to cover 3 topics today, and I have promised this is going to be short, but I will stick around to answer questions. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, what are the 4 critical components of a story that sells? And we're going to see that's different from what you usually hear when you talk about what makes a story a good story. We're not going to talk about the arc and the conflict. We're going to talk about 4 very specific components of a marketing story, a business story. It's not the same as the components of a fairy tale or an adventure story or a campfire story. I don't know. I keep saying campfire story. I don't know. Do people still go to have campfires? But it's a great metaphor. So and the second topic is going to be find your winning story. What is the story that you need for your brand? We have the 5 archetypes. I am just going to look at 3 of them, the most common among service marketers, but I will take questions on the others. But we're going to see that the story that's going to work for you is based on your archetype, your persona, not on some generic idea of what is a story. And finally, we're going to start talking about, how do you explain what you do in a way that makes people want to work with you? The best way to do that is to tell a success story. 4 components of a success story that will explain what you do and make people want to work with you. So let's get going here. We're going to look at the 4 critical components of a story that sells. And you can see there's nothing here about conflict, hero, antagonist, guide. There are 4 qualities, and we're going to look at each of these in turn. Overview: purposeful stories, relatable, true, and consistent. That means consistent with each other and with your brand. So the first critical component of a business story is to have a story that fits your purpose. A lot of times we think that a story is something to be entertaining. So you hear a lot about stories engage, stories get people involved. And that is absolutely true. That is a major factor in a story, that you want to keep your clients listening or reading. And once people start on a story, once they hear those magic words, once upon a time, or whatever you start with, and in business we tend to start not with that, although we could, but kind of in the middle, you have a hard time stopping. We do sometimes say once upon a time to emphasize the fact in a lighthearted manner that we're telling a story. But once people get started on it, they want to keep going. They want to know where this is going to go. But the key is, what story will fit your purpose? Why are you telling this story? And I would argue or suggest that in business, the question, why are you telling the story, is more important than what's your story? What do you want to learn about? What do you want your clients to know? How do you want your clients to change as a result of hearing this story? That's a key component of storytelling. And secondly, to make it relatable to your audience. Now, the way to do that is to have a story where people can imagine themselves in the story, which means they've been there, or they wish they had, or they know about it. So I'll give you some examples. A lot of times people will tell you to share a story about yourself, about some hardship you went through, or about some exotic experience you had. So people will say, wow, you did that. For example, I lived in Alaska for 2 years. I was teaching at the university. And I've had people say to me, well, why don't you tell stories about your time in Alaska? And it's a great idea, except that a lot of people are just not interested. They just do not relate to it. Or if they might read a travel book, but they certainly don't want to have someone talk to them about a place they've never been. It doesn't help them understand the point that you want to make. It doesn't really help you connect with them when you talk about something like that. So for example, I have a story. When I lived in Alaska, one of my colleagues liked to fly airplanes, and he used to rent a Cessna, and we flew all over Alaska, and we flew up to the North Pole. Well, not quite the North Pole, but we crossed the Arctic Circle. We went to Nome, we went to different places, and the guy had less than 100 hours of flying time, which nobody else was really dumb enough to go up with a guy like that, who was a flyer with low hours on his logbook. But of course I did. And one time we were going through the mountains and the plane started to shake, and he turned to me and said, wow, this is great to learn mountain flying. And I'm like, we're learning mountain flying? I thought you knew mountain flying. So actually, I did not say that. I thought it, because when you're with a pilot, you do not want to make them nervous, especially when you're at whatever, 10, 15,000 feet, and you're in the mountain. You want to keep things light and comfortable, and you do not want to make the pilot nervous. A lot of people told me to keep doing that, to tell stories like that. But to be honest, people were just not interested in stories about Alaska and Cessnas and flying through mountains. They hadn't done it. It was not something they particularly wanted to do. So that was not a good story. A lot of times I use examples from sports because most audiences, or I should say many audiences, especially in the US, especially when you live in Philadelphia, in a city that won the Super Bowl last year, you can tell a story about sports, especially football, and your audience will love it. It's something they can relate to very easily. But you still have to be careful, because one time I told a story about football, and I was giving a talk to an audience composed primarily of tech guys who were in this organization where they did a lot of coding and they did a lot of back-end work. They were totally uninterested in that story. They looked at me like, where are you coming from? We don't care about Nick Foles or Carson Wentz. Those are our quarterbacks here. But they didn't know that either. That's the kind of thing you want to think about is, how will your audience relate to the story you're telling? Will they be able to put themselves in the picture with you? And there are techniques you can use if they relate. You can say things like, imagine that we're on an airplane and you're sitting next to me. Or imagine that you're looking over my shoulder while I do things. You can use those as ways to engage your audience, especially when you're going live. But that often isn't enough. Most people have been on an airplane, so that's pretty safe. But if you've got a rare audience that doesn't go anywhere, then it may not be. So think about what they will relate to. Oops. And then the third point is to make it completely true. And I'm not going to spend much time on this. It should be obvious, but it's not. There are some gurus out there. There are some marketing coaches out there who have advised people to tell a heartbreaking story about themselves, something that will make the audience empathize, even if you have to make it up. That is not good advice. It's not something you want to do. Your audience most likely will sense that you are faking, and they will tune right out. And of course, you have to be consistent. I once heard one well-known person talking about how she got started in business. And she said, well, I did this. I need to buy a new suit. So I maxed out my credit cards and got what the wardrobe I needed. And then she wanted to fly to hear some famous person speak. So she said, well, I maxed out my credit cards to buy a plane ticket. And the third time she was telling stories about maxing out her credit cards, it was like, how many times can you do this before they take your credit cards away? So the audience could tell that was not a true story. Certainly it was exaggerated. It may have had a grain of truth. So think about being completely truthful. But again, I probably don't have to say too much about that because most people recognize that. And finally, this is something people don't talk about very much, but your story has to be consistent with your brand as we define brand for a small business. When you're a small business, especially a solopreneur, you are your brand. So your story has to be very consistent. You know, it's like if you go to a party and this friend of yours who you always knew as being a very serious, very nice, approachable, but very serious, maybe they are sort of almost an academic type, someone you look up to and respect, and they start telling stories that would be more appropriate to a fraternity. I don't want to characterize fraternities in a bad way, but let's say the stereotype fraternity boy type stories, you would say that just isn't consistent. What's wrong with this picture? And you might be perfectly happy to hear those stories from someone who consistently had that image of maybe being a party type person and someone who likes to go out and drink and do all, not that drinking is bad, but they want to go out and party and have a lot to drink and talk a lot about how much they were drinking. That's one persona, and you may like that persona or you may not like that persona, but it's consistent. If you like the person and they consistently tell a certain type of story, you'll go back. If you don't like that person, you don't hang around with them. And that's how you want your clients to feel. If you tell stories that are consistent with your persona, and we're going to look at that in just a moment, then they will know you and they'll expect a certain type of story. And I know myself, every so often I've tried stories that do not fit before I figured out this framework. So I remember when this one person was talking about how she had told a story about a cat. And it was the first time she had done that. She had always been very serious before that. And she wrote on her blog, I can't believe how much response I got to this cat story. I'm going to be more personal from now on. So I thought, well, gee, maybe that's what I should do too. I should be more personal. So I told a few stories about nothing particularly special, and they totally bombed. People were just uninterested because she was what we call, we're going to look at that in just a minute, a celebrity type, a celebrity archetype. That was her persona. She's very out there. She likes to talk about how successful she is. She talks about how much she's accumulated, how well she's done. And she's the kind of person a lot of people want to be like her. So the kind of stories she tells are stories about herself because people feel that she's unveiling a secret. When I tell those stories, I'm an educator type. People don't care. They want me to come right to the point because they've been trained by experience, the way you're trained to expect certain types of stories from your friends. They have been conditioned to expect me to tell certain types of stories. And when I go on, occasionally I can get away with it. And sometimes that people really like those stories if they make a point, if I'm using them to educate. But if I go off on a tangent and I tell stories about a vacation in the Bahamas and staying in that's not who they want to, that's not what they want to hear from me. And it's incongruent. So they will, in some cases, tune out. So I hope that makes sense. But the next thing we're going to talk about is continuing on that point of finding a story that works for you. When I said be consistent about your storytelling, this is what I mean. Find your archetype, which if you don't like the word archetype, and there are a few people who don't, you can talk about your persona or your pattern, but that's really the foundation of your brand. And I'm sure if you're on this call, you've probably seen, I have a workbook on branding with story, very easy to download. It's currently free. And you can read more about the 5 archetypes, but I'm going to briefly go through what they are and show how they fit into creating a story that is your winning story. By that, I mean, this is the story that you tell about yourself, that you tell when someone says, tell me about you, what's your story? You bring out a story. And depending on your archetype, it may not even be a story about you. It may not be a how I got here story. So it's very important to understand your archetype if you are a small service business. And there is a disclaimer here. I sometimes get asked, well, what would be the persona or what would be the archetype for Coca-Cola? And the answer is, I have no idea, because I work with small service-based businesses. They have their own firms. But there's another big difference, which is that Coca-Cola and Budweiser and Harley Davidson, all those big companies, they make products. And when you have a product, it's made of metal or cloth or wood or some other substance. It doesn't have a personality. I mean, if you think about it, beer doesn't have a personality. It doesn't have really a persona. Beer is just a bunch of chemicals in liquid form until you create a personality. So in the big companies, the big iconic brands, they have had agencies who sat around and for quite a bit of money made up brands. They made up personalities to go with these products. Totally imaginary. Their products, their archetypes for these iconic brands, the personalities of these iconic brands are designed to be personalities that the customers will relate to. If you are an individual, if you're an accountant or a coach or a consultant or a financial planner, you have to work with your own personality. You don't make one up. You work with the one that feels comfortable to you and the way you will deliver your marketing. So we have the 5 types here. I haven't found any service businesses that don't fit these. Sometimes you have to understand the definition to make them fit, but they seem to fit the ones that certainly that I work with and that most of my clients are, and many of the people you work with, whether it's a lawyer or even, I think I've even figured out you could get a doctor, a dentist, you could get an architect, home stage, any of those could fit into these personas. And it's important to understand that it's not about what you do. So if you're a lawyer, you could be any one of the 5. If you're a life coach, you could be any one of the 5, depending on how you choose to present yourself in marketing. So let's look, for example, we're going to look at the first 3 because those are the most common. Just to go through very briefly, the role model is like, I think it is a girl or boy next door. They're the ones who say, I'm just like you. If I can do it, you can do it. The innovator is the person who says, I've got something no one else has. If you want it, you work with me. They usually say it in a friendlier way, but that's their message. The educator is someone who markets by presenting information and creating aha moments. The way they market is they give you information so that you say, this is really cool. I want to apply it to my business and I'm willing to pay you so you can customize it for me or so I can go in at a deeper level and learn. The celebrity is the person who not necessarily is a real celebrity. They don't have to be famous, but they are on a stage and they are aspirational. In fact, I originally called this aspirational, but the celebrity sounds more fun and more, I think people get it more. There's someone who embodies what you would like to be and definitely not who you are now. You relate to them more as a fan club than as a friend. They keep their distance. They talk a lot about places that they're going to. They talk about their cars, their boats, their first class airfare, and their luxuries a lot of the time. That makes them a celebrity. And I'll also give you one tip. If you get a lot of emails, like I do, from different businesses, the ones who sign themselves XO or Love or Hugs, almost always that's a celebrity archetype. They're giving out a lot of love, a lot of caring, but it's on a very broad scale. The role model really cares about you one-to-one, or that's their projection. You feel like you know them. In fact, role models have to be careful because people sometimes walk right in to their homes. I've heard of role models who found someone on their doorstep, literally, who said, I've been following you on the internet. I came to visit. Can we have lunch? This does not happen with a celebrity. And the passionate advocate, I didn't think there were very many people who fit this, but people are telling me. For example, I knew a banker who actually took a phone call from a customer at 3:00 in the morning. Is that they have the kind of bank where they work with a lot of high-end or high net worth clients, so they have their phone numbers, and the client can just call or text if they need something. So this particular banker took a call at 3 a.m. I'd call that passionate advocate. These are the people who will do anything, pretty much anything, to give you what you need. So for example, if you're a wedding planner, you could be a passionate advocate if you say that you show up for the wedding and the flowers are wilted and you'll drive 2 hours to get fresh flowers so the bride won't be disappointed. Or you could be a lawyer. Actually, this idea came to me because I had a client who was an immigration lawyer, and he once tracked down a client. He crossed 3 state lines to find the person, and turned out they were being held in a prison in a different state. He had to talk the warden into letting him get to meet his client, and turned the client actually was not even someone who could have been deported. The client was actually a U.S. citizen with a mistaken identity situation. So that's a great story for a passionate advocate who's a lawyer. But the key to remember is you can be any one of these. Usually the role will find itself. And that's why people who relate to this usually have been in business more than a month or two. They're usually been in business at least 2 or 3 years. They know who they are and they know how they like to relate to their clients. So let's look in detail at each one. Again, it'll be brief, but more detail. So first, the role model. The role model says, if I can do it, you can too. So what do they do? What kind of stories do they tell? Well, when they're giving a talk and they're introducing themselves, or someone says, what's your story? They say things like, I was working with a client and the client wasn't able to have any money to come and visit me. This is actually one of Connie Reagan Green's stories, and she's a perfect role model. She's always talking about how she's had to overcome obstacles. She talks about her own personal life, and she relates that to the client and says, I have all these disadvantages, but I could do this, you can. So she has a story that I think would be perfect for any situation when someone says, Connie, what's your story? She could say, she knew these people who had retired and they didn't have a lot of money. Every time she'd invite them to come visit, they would say, well, we can't, we have no money. And she kept talking about what she did, and she said, well, whenever you're ready, just call me. And one day they said, well, why can't we do what you do? And she said, there's no reason. If I can do it, you can do it. And she taught them some things, and she got them started on the internet. And the next time she called them to invite them, they were gone on an exotic vacation. They'd earned so much money following her advice. That's a really good role model story. It doesn't have to be about how you got here, although it could. Role models do talk about themselves in a way that relates, but they talk about themselves as overcoming the kind of obstacles they know their clients want to overcome. So they might say things like, I used to be terrified of speaking, and if I can overcome my fear of speaking, you can too. That's the kind of story that a role model might tell if they were asked, what's your story? If they're introducing themselves at a meeting, at a networking event, if they're writing their bio, that's a good story for a role model. Now, an innovator tells a different story. An innovator says something like, I've got something nobody else has. They don't usually use those words, but that's the gist of it. So, for example, Christina Hills is the ultimate innovator. She has created a really clever way to teach people how to use WordPress. She's got a special platform that she had built for her, where you can actually set up a WordPress site that's hidden from the search engine. So you can experiment and play and make mistakes. And she's got all kinds of other things built into the whole program. It's very, very comprehensive. So what kind of stories would she tell? Well, a lot of her stories are about people who were miserable and had a really hard time with their websites, spent a lot of money, wasted a lot of energy until they found her innovation. That's an innovator type story. And they tell related stories about, they might write articles about different components of what they do. So Christina has articles and occasional webinars on different types of websites people can have, and she talks about things that are of concern to people who want to build websites. The key stories that she tells are stories about people who really struggle to build websites. They got stuck with bad webmasters, and now after taking her course, a lot of times they're actually building websites for other people. So those are the kinds of stories. And notice that's not really a struggle story. It may not even be about her. It's a story about what she does and how she does it. Then the educator archetype, that would be Ian Brody. Some of you know him. Tara McMullen is an educator. I'm an educator. They're people who market by giving you information and new ideas, giving you aha moments. So you get an aha moment, like, wow, I never saw things that way. And then you want more. You sense this person can get what you're about because they've told a story that resonates. So Tara had a taxonomy or a classification or framework of business models, and I have a framework of stories. And Ian has some unique ways of going about email marketing, and he's got a new thing now with the half-hour marketing plan. So those are the kinds of things that an educator does. So an educator doesn't tell stories about how I got here, because people don't care, and that's not what an educator does well. What an educator would talk about would be a story that makes a point. So they might say something like, here's an example of a business, or here's an example of a story that explains why this kind of marketing, why this type of email marketing, why this type of storytelling works better than other types of storytelling, why this type of business model fits, and why you need to know your business model. And that would be the kind of story they would tell. The idea is to give an aha moment to the client, so they go away and say, oh, okay, that's something I can do. So those are the three types I'm going to talk about. There are two more, the celebrity and the passionate advocate. But so that's really a key part of storytelling when we're getting into the basics, is to find your archetype. Because as a business person, as a small service-based business person, you need to start with your archetype and then build on that, because everything will start from that. You'll be consistent. You'll have stories to tell. You'll know what kind of story to tell when. And that will help you meet the 4 criteria we talked about. So now I don't see questions, so we will move on to a template for your success story. And I'm going to tell you there are 4 parts to this. So the problem, the moment of truth, your role, and the outcome. Notice we aren't talking about conflict. We're not talking about the arc. We're not talking about path or journey. We're talking about 4 parts of your success story. And this is the story that you tell when someone says, what do you do exactly? This is the story you tell when someone says, what makes you different? But it's not your success. It's your client's success. And someone, I'm sure, is thinking, well, I don't have clients, or yeah, I'm too new, or I'm moving into a new business, a new area, a new direction, and I don't have clients for my new business. What do I do? Well, it's okay to say this is what could happen, as long as you make it very clear that this is an imaginary example. And you can use composites. It's perfectly okay to take 2 or 3 clients and merge them together, because you may, especially in some particular fields, you've got to do that because you have to protect your clients' privacy. The first part of the template, the first question is, what is the problem? Again, from the client's perspective, how is this problem affecting the client's life, their work, their relationship, their emotions? You want to get as to what is bothering them. So here's an example. I'm on the right side of this notebook. Let's imagine someone named Nancy, and you always want to give these people a name. You always give them a name, and you speak about them very respectfully. If you disrespect your clients, if you speak disrespectfully in your stories, your prospects are going to wonder if you'll be disrespectful to them. So we're going to name her Nancy. You make up some details, only a few. You don't have to talk about her hair, unless you're a hairstylist or an image consultant. You don't have to get into what she looks like. And you often have to change the occupation because of privacy concerns. So let's make her a librarian. And she's worried about money. She just went through a very bitter divorce. She's left with medical bills. She's been struggling for months to make ends meet, and it's beginning to affect her work. So we get a sense of her emotions. That's the problem. And then we have, what's their last straw moment or moment of truth? What made them call you? Because usually when people hire a professional, something's happened. Maybe it's their own feeling of this has got to change. Maybe something on the outside. Maybe they got sick and they have to be hospitalized. That happens a lot with fitness professionals, where the client comes to them because the doctor said, you either take a handful of pills every day or you work with a fitness consultant or a trainer and you change things. So let's look at our example here. We have Nancy, the librarian, worried about money. Her last straw moment is, in this case, she realized she hates her tiny apartment. Maybe she just looked at it a new way. Maybe someone came over and made a comment. You would actually in a real story, you would flesh this out and you would have more details. And here's where you might have to draw on some facts from your real clients or embellish it somewhat, as long as it's realistic and true to the facts. She began to feel she'd never be able to live at a house. She'd never own a house. She'd always be stuck in tiny apartments. So she just said, something's got to give. And that's her last straw moment. That's when she says, I need help. I've got to be able to buy a house. So then she comes to you, and what was your role in helping them? And we're assuming that you're a financial planner. You could, of course, be other things. You could be a therapist. You could be a life coach. You could be all kinds of, maybe a money coach. We're going to assume you're a financial planner. And when you think about your role, you think, okay, what were some special techniques? Do you have proprietary programs? Do you have experience in this area that helps you? And the content of this component of your story depends on your archetype. So as a financial planner, you might say you used to fight proprietary program. Maybe you have a program to help people who get in this kind of trouble. Some planners do, some don't. Some do not work with this kind of client. So their story would be different. They would not use the story. They talk about someone who had money and was worried about leaving it to the grandchildren, something like that. Maybe you've had years of experience, so you're really qualified, and that reassures people to do that. So if you're a role model financial planner, now again, if you're a role model as a planner or an advisor or a doctor, it doesn't mean you say, I expect you to be like me someday, which may be the case in marketing. It's really more saying, I know where you're coming from. I'm giving you advice because I've studied this a little more. It's like if you were back in college and you said, well, that's my major, so I can help you, or I'm farther along than you are, so I can help you. You're not on a pedestal. Obviously, you don't have to follow this archetype. You could be, depending on how you're comfortable presenting. But if you are a role model, you'd say, I know where you're coming from. Now, I wanted to use this as an example because I wanted to point out that if you are a financial planner, you don't want to tell the kind of story about how you struggle and you almost went bankrupt, or maybe you did go bankrupt. That's going to make your client nervous. It's very important to tell a story that will make your client feel comfortable working with you. So instead of saying, I had trouble with money, you could say something like, I have always had trouble learning something new, and I know finance, this is my field. But if I had to learn art, or if I had to understand software design, or if I had to understand the medical field, I would be lost. So I know exactly what you're doing. And you might tell a story based on that. Or you could tell a story about how a client helped and how well they did. So you could tell different kinds of stories. But the key here is when you're talking about your success, the way you describe helping this client is going to depend on your archetype. So let's say you're an educator rather than a role model. You might have a whole different content in this section of your story. You might say, okay, here's the logic behind my recommendations. Or you might say, I've got this framework. I've got this 3-step method that I've come up with. And if you follow it, you'll be fine. So it's really important to talk about your role. This is actually the heart of your story. And it's really important to work on this. And finally, what was the outcome? And obviously, this is important. But clients, you're going to find they're more interested in what you did than the outcome. They assume the outcome is going to be happy, or you would not be telling the story. But you want something realistic, cannot be a fairy tale, it cannot be waved a magic wand if you're trying to communicate what you do. So 8 months after we began working together, she moved into her new home. Now, this actually is based on a real story that I heard at a networking event. So it's a real possibility. I would not say, well, 6 months after working with me, she was on her second million, because that would not be realistic. Okay, here's a question from Kelly. How about telling a story about myself that includes when I was new as an educational trainer and how I learned to train using interactive strategies? I would tell them I wasn't good at interactive training, but then I was able to learn the strategies and quickly implement them. Well, if you are teaching people to become interactive themselves, that would be, my hope is to show the audience if I can do it, you can too. That is terrific. This would be a good story to tell as your story. Remember, we just talked about how do you answer the question, what's your story? In the earlier part, we said, what's the winning story? What's the story you tell if you're introducing yourself at a networking event or a lunch? That might be one. But if you want to talk about how you work with clients and help them, then you would use the kind of story where you would follow the template we're talking about now. You'd give an example of a client. You might say, I was working with Maybell or Susan. I try to come up with exotic names when I describe clients because I don't want people to think I'm talking about them. But or Susanna, and she was just totally unconvinced. So you would tell a similar story, but you make it more about how you help. And I worked with Susanna, and I told her how I had helped. Let's see. Susanna was terrified of working with people. She was terrified of talking to people. Let's see what you know about her. She felt inadequate because she didn't have a college degree. She was really uncertain. And what I did in working with her, I showed her my program that I had developed. Now, it may be that you could say I reassured her that I had been through the same thing. If you think that will resonate with your audience and show what you do, that's fine. But remember, when you're telling this kind of story, what you want to do is show your client exactly what you do and how you do it. You may not ever need to do that. But if you do need to do that, then you want to tell a story about a client you helped, where they were coming from. In this case, let's say your imaginary client, Maybell, was terrified of people, was shy, felt inadequate. And what you did was you worked with her, and you have a 3-step program that you followed, and you introduced her to your technique of working with the audience when you're absolutely terrified. You have these 3 strategies to calm down when you're scared. And now Maybell is speaking to large audiences and commanding 5-figure fees, and she's traveling all over the world. That would be a good story to tell, to show what you did. And you'd go much more into what you did, how you worked with her. Because again, this goes back to what we talked about purpose. These parts of a story all work together. Start with why you're telling the story. A story about yourself. What is the purpose of that? Does it make people feel more comfortable working with you? Yes, it can. If you're trying to overcome their fear, yes, that can be very effective. If you're trying to show them what it's going to be like to work with me, what will I learn? What do I actually do? How will the transformation happen? Then you tell a different kind of story. Does that make sense? Because if it, type into the chat box if it makes sense to you and to other people, because I really think we start with the purpose. And again, my purpose, I hope, is to show the audience if I can, they can too. That's great. That is a way of showing how you relate, but it really usually is not the whole story. It's a part of the story. And it depends on where you're going to tell the story. That's the key. You also have the option of being a role model for some of your audience and an educator for another segment, if you can keep them separate. I definitely recommend having one archetype and being consistent, because that's how you build your brand. A role model and an educator don't tell the same kind of stories. A role model would tell stories, would say, well, I was scared, I didn't know how to do it, and if I can do it. And then we'd go on to talk about some of the things that she helps people with. An educator does not do that for 2 reasons. The educator doesn't come across as scared or nervous. If they do, it's in a very specific context. I was new to this, and I knew I had to learn something, and yes, I was scared, but the focus is on not their feeling of being scared. It's not on them. It might be an analogy. It's being used to make a point. So it's not really the same. And if you mix the stories, it can be tricky, because I know I'm an educator, and whenever I've tried to tell role model stories, like, here I am, I can do what you do, they just bob. And so you may want to experiment and see which stories go over better, which ones you're more comfortable telling. The role model is really has a whole thing about being more sympathetic. And, you're always sympathetic and respectful of your clients, but you tell different kinds of stories. So as an educator, let me give you a good example. Ian Brody had a story where he talked about once when he was giving, in the middle of a webinar, he was at home in his home office, and some family members showed up at the doorstep. He said, you can't send them away. You can't say, oh, you're an hour early, go find yourself a place to go have a drink. And he had to interrupt the webinar. But he said what turned out that when he interrupted the webinar, he was able to communicate with his audience, and they actually enjoyed hearing the story because they said, wow, this is nice, you're human. Now, a role model would just say, well, here's an example. I had this, and I get interruptions, and if you get interruptions, yeah, you're just like me, and It's normal. Everyone does this. But the educator, like Ian, would say, now, here's why I'm telling you this story. It's because when you have a business, you are going to have interruptions. And what you want to do is take those interruptions and make them assets into your business. You make them work for you and not against you. So he told a story as an educator to make a point about how you work in business with interruptions. A role model will tell the same story, but would have more about, this is a way of getting to know me better. And this is more like, well, see, this is an example. And I have interruptions too. And just like you, and yet I still manage to go ahead and deliver my work week after week, something like that. Now, there will be exceptions. In some cases, role models will sometimes tell stories that are more educational. The educator does every so often tell a personal story. But overall, the more consistent you are with your brand, the stronger and more powerful your brand will be, and the easier it will be to have to tell a message. The messages are different. The educator primarily is working with giving people aha moments and getting them more like, oh yeah, I never thought of that before. And the role model is more reassuring and saying, yeah, hey, you can do this, I can do it. And they also tend to attract different clients. Educators like me and like the people I mentioned, Ian and Tara, tend to attract people who have a more logical, they're more left brain, they tend to be more educated. Doesn't mean the other people are not. I mean, some of these people are fabulously educated, they have very advanced degrees, but overall, they're looking for a logical explanation. They want to be sold with logic. They want to hear that you've got a framework that they can apply. They're not necessarily interested in yourself and your background. So that's kind of a long answer, but let me know if it makes sense to you, and that you kind of have to, I would say, stick to one as much as possible. And if it becomes uncomfortable, you can grow out of them. Very few people start out as celebrities. In fact, one person who is definitely a celebrity, it really is a celebrity and uses that archetype, started out as a role model. It was more of a girl next door in the early stages, and then became a celebrity. And I see people gravitating to different roles. But one reason it's important to know your archetype is that when you choose a mentor, you want your mentor to be as much like your role model, as much like your archetype as possible. So I've tried to learn from all kinds of people, and I can learn from Connie, who is a role model, and I can learn from someone who's a celebrity. But if I try to write the way they do, and if they say, well, hey, I use this is how I sign off on my emails, it's not going to work, because I am a different type of archetype. My audience expects something different. It just isn't consistent. And just like I said, if you're at a party and someone makes a joke or a comment that doesn't fit the way you know them, it's not comfortable. It may not make a difference as much, but if it's a little jarring in some cases. Sometimes it's not very big, especially if it's an occasional situation, but it can be. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope to see you again on a future webinar.